AITA for punching my brother in the face at my dad's birthday over his comments about my pregnant wife. I, 36M, am about to become a father for the first time. My wife, Riley, 35F, and I are expecting our baby girl in about a month, and while we're thrilled, there's an undercurrent of anxiety that never really goes away. Riley and I have been together since college. She's my soulmate, my best friend, and the love of my life. But 3 years ago, we faced the darkest time of our lives. Riley had a stillbirth at 32 weeks. It was the kind of pain that leaves you shattered. While it was devastating for me, I can't even begin to imagine what it was like for her. She carried our son, loved him before he even came into the world, and then in an instant he was... This pregnancy has been full of joy and fear. Every doctor's appointment feels like walking a tightrope, and Riley's been having nightmares. She tells me she's afraid to let herself get too excited, terrified that something might go wrong again. I try my best to be supportive, but there's always this nagging feeling that I can't fully protect her from the pain she's been through. My family is close-knit, but not without its problems. I'm the oldest of 3 kids. There's my sister Ella, 33F, who's a nurse and one of the most caring people I know, and my brother Josh, 30M, who's always been the family's wild card. Growing up, Josh was the golden boy, charming, popular, and naturally talented at just about everything. But as we got older, the cracks started to show. He went to law school on a scholarship, but partied too hard and flunked out. After that, he tried acting, thinking he'd become a star overnight. When that didn't work out, he settled for a teaching job at a private high school, but even that didn't last. He didn't get his contract renewed and hasn't held a steady job since. For the past year, Josh and his wife Julia have been living with my parents. According to my mom, he spends most days drinking, sulking, and complaining about how unfair life is. He blames everyone else for his failures, our parents, the system, the economy, but never himself. It's like he's stuck in this loop of self-pity and resentment. Julia's tried to help him get back on his feet, but she's in way over her head. I've watched her go from being this bright, upbeat person to someone who's constantly stressed and on edge. Everyone in my family adores Riley. She's a federal public defender who fights for people who don't have anyone else in their corner. Despite coming from a well-off family, she's never been snobbish or entitled. She's just kind, hardworking, and genuine. But for some reason, Josh can't stand her. Maybe it's jealousy, maybe it's because she represents everything he wishes he could be, but he's always making snide comments. He calls her princess in this mocking tone, makes digs about her job, and constantly tries to belittle her success. I've confronted him about it countless times, but Riley always asks me to let it go. She says it's not worth the drama, and she's used to dealing with difficult people, especially since she grew up with 3 brothers herself. But it's more than just annoying to me. It's infuriating. I've tried to shield Riley from Josh's bitterness, but it feels like I'm always on edge, waiting for him to say something that crosses the line. Last night was my dad's birthday, and my parents planned a family dinner to celebrate. They went all out. My mom cooked his favorite dishes, Ella brought a cake, and we were all trying to make it a special night. As soon as Riley and I arrived, I noticed that Josh was already drunk. He was slumped in his chair, slurring his words, and knocking back champagne like it was water. Julia kept trying to get him to stop, whispering to him to slow down, but he brushed her off every time. The dinner itself was tense. My parents were clearly uncomfortable, trying to pretend everything was fine, while Josh kept making inappropriate comments under his breath. Ella was quiet, which isn't like her, and even Riley seemed unusually on edge. As the night went on, Josh's behavior got worse. He made a comment about how he should have been the one to marry into a rich family, which Julia clearly heard but pretended to ignore. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I was determined to keep things civil for my dad's sake. Then, near the end of dinner, my mom asked Riley how she was feeling about the pregnancy. Riley smiled, trying to be positive, and said that everything was going well so far. My mom got emotional and said she was thinking of us every day, praying that this time would be different. That's when Josh decided to chime in. "It can't go worse than last time, right?" he said, his words slurring as he laughed at his own twisted joke. The room went dead silent. Riley's face fell, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. It was like every fear and every nightmare she'd had about losing our daughter was suddenly being thrown in her face. I tried to keep my cool and told Josh that his comment was completely inappropriate. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "I mean, the only way it could be worse is if Riley dies too," he said, still chuckling. "So, if you had to pick, would you rather save her or the baby?" Everyone exploded at once, yelling, shouting, trying to get him to stop. But I didn't hear any of it. I saw red. I shoved Josh off his chair, and before I knew it, my fist connected with his face. He went down, and my dad and brother-in-law had to pull me off him. Josh was sprawled on the floor, blood dripping from his nose, and Julia was in tears, trying to help him up. Riley was crying too, her hand trembling as she clutched my arm. I've never felt so furious or so helpless in my entire life. I grabbed Riley, told my parents we were leaving, and we walked out. On the way home, Riley sobbed quietly in the car. She kept saying that she couldn't believe how cruel Josh had been and that she didn't understand why he hated her so much. She said it was the most hurtful thing anyone had ever said to her, and I could see how deeply it had cut her. It was like Josh had taken every fear she had and thrown it in her face just to get a reaction. The next morning, I got a call from my mom. She was upset, her voice shaky as she told me she'd kicked Josh out of the house. He and Julia were now staying with her sister, at least temporarily. My mom said that Josh didn't even remember what he'd said and that he felt terrible when Julia told him. Apparently, he's agreed to go to rehab because he knows he has a drinking problem. But it wasn't just about the alcohol. My mom also revealed something I hadn't known before. Josh had been sexually abused as a child by a friend's dad, something he's never dealt with and which, according to her, has contributed to his downward spiral. I felt sick hearing that. I never knew about the abuse, and while it doesn't excuse what he said, it put some of his behavior into context. My mom pleaded with me to consider forgiving Josh eventually, saying he's been through so much and needs our support. But I told her flat out, I don't care what he's been through. What he said to Riley was unforgivable, and I have no intention of letting him near her ever again. My mom also said she thought I owed Josh an apology for hitting him, and that I'd ruined my dad's birthday by escalating things. She said it wasn't okay to resort to violence, no matter how angry I was, and that I needed to be the bigger person. But all I could think about was Riley, crying in the car, and how I'd let her down by not protecting her from Josh sooner. I haven't even told Riley about my mom's call because I don't want to put any more stress on her. She's been through enough already. Later that morning, Riley's oldest brother, Ryan, called me. Ryan's always been fiercely protective of Riley, and he was furious. Riley had called him the night before, and he came over to help comfort her. Ryan asked me how I could let Josh's behavior go on for so long and told me that he never wanted to see Josh again. I tried to explain that I didn't think Josh would ever go this far, but Ryan wasn't having it. He told me I should have done more to keep Riley safe and that he was disappointed in me for not stepping up sooner. He hung up before I could say anything else. Riley's tried to smooth things over, telling Ryan that it wasn't my fault and that she was the one who always asked me to ignore Josh's comments. But Ryan's still upset, and he hasn't returned any of my calls since. I get it though, I'm angry at myself too. I keep replaying the night in my head, thinking of all the times I could have put a stop to Josh's behavior before it escalated to this. Riley's told me over and over that it's not my fault, but I can't help feeling like I failed her. A couple of days passed, and Josh still hadn't reached out to apologize directly. I wasn't expecting much, but a part of me thought maybe he'd at least send a message or have Julia pass along some kind of apology. But there was nothing, just radio silence. Meanwhile, Riley's been trying to focus on the baby, but it's like this cloud is hanging over us. She keeps having flashbacks of that night, and every time her phone rings, I can see her flinch, worried it's more bad news. I've been trying to be strong for her, but the truth is, I'm exhausted. I'm angry, hurt, and stuck between wanting to move on and being unable to let go of the rage I feel towards my brother. Riley's been seeing her therapist more frequently, trying to work through her anxiety and the emotional fallout from what Josh said. She's always been strong, but I can see how deeply this has affected her. We spent the next weekend at home, just the two of us. I made her breakfast, and we watched movies to distract ourselves. For a moment, things felt normal again. But then, the nightmares returned, and Riley woke up in a cold sweat, trembling and crying. She told me she dreamed that something went wrong with the baby, and Josh was there, laughing, saying it was her fault. I held her until she calmed down, but I could feel my own anger simmering just beneath the surface. A few days later, Julia called me. She sounded worn out and apologetic, and I could tell she was struggling to hold it together. Julia's been with Josh since college, and she's seen the best and the worst of him. She told me that Josh was in rehab and that he was finally getting the help he needed. She apologized on his behalf, saying that Josh was deeply ashamed of what he'd said and that he couldn't even bring himself to face us yet. Julia also shared more about the abuse Josh had suffered. She said that he's been carrying that trauma for years and that it's been eating away at him, leading to his drinking and self-destructive behavior. She asked me if I could ever find it in my heart to forgive him, not for Josh's sake, but for hers, because she didn't know how much longer she could keep holding everything together. I didn't know what to say. I felt sympathy for Julia, and I knew she was in an incredibly difficult position. But forgiveness felt like an impossible ask at that moment. I told her I appreciated her call and that I hoped Josh got the help he needed, but I couldn't make any promises. She thanked me and said she understood, but the sadness in her voice lingered with me long after we hung up. About a week later, my mom called again and asked if we could all sit down and talk. My parents, Josh, Julia, Ella, and me. She said Josh wanted to apologize in person, that he was in a much clearer state of mind and needed to make amends. Riley was adamant about not going. She didn't want to be in the same room as Josh, and I couldn't blame her. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go either, but after a long conversation with Riley, she encouraged me to at least hear Josh out. She said it might be the only way to get closure and move forward, even if forgiveness was off the table. The meeting was tense from the start. We met at my parents' house, and it was like walking into a minefield of emotions. My dad looked worn down, my mom kept fidgeting nervously, and Ella just stared at her phone, clearly uncomfortable. Josh was sitting on the couch, looking thinner and more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook slightly as he tried to compose himself. Josh started by apologizing to my parents first, saying he knew he'd been a burden on them and that he was sorry for everything he'd put them through. He then turned to me, his voice cracking as he apologized for what he'd said to Riley. He said he didn't remember saying it, but that was no excuse. He admitted that he'd been angry, jealous, and had let his pain turn him into someone he didn't even recognize. "I know I've messed up everything," he said, his voice breaking, "but I'm trying to change. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly." I listened, but I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to believe that he was finally on the right path, but another part of me couldn't forget the pain he'd caused. The apology felt genuine, but it didn't erase the damage done. I told Josh that while I appreciated his words, it wasn't up to me to forgive him. It was Riley who deserved the apology the most. I made it clear that until she felt ready, I wouldn't be pushing her to reconcile. Josh nodded, tears streaming down his face, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the brother I used to know. Since that meeting, things have been complicated. Riley and I are trying to move forward, focusing on the baby and the future we want to build together. We've been redecorating the nursery, picking out baby names, and doing all the little things that bring us joy amidst the chaos. Every day is a new challenge, but we're taking it one step at a time. Josh is still in rehab, and Julia has been visiting him regularly. My mom updates me occasionally, telling me about Josh's progress and how he's slowly coming to terms with his past. I'm glad he's getting help, but I've made it clear that my priority is Riley and our child. Josh has a long road ahead of him, and while I hope he finds peace, I'm not ready to let him back into our lives just yet. As for Riley's brother Ryan, he's still keeping his distance, but I've reached out a few times to let him know that I'm doing everything I can to support Riley. I'm hoping that with time, he'll see that I'm doing my best to protect her, even if I didn't always handle things perfectly in the past. The weeks went by, and soon enough, it was time for our baby girl to arrive. Riley went into labor late one night, and everything else faded into the background. I held her hand through every contraction, every push, and when our daughter finally made her entrance into the world, it felt like a weight had been lifted. She was perfect, tiny, and strong, and as I watched Riley hold her for the first time, I knew that this was what mattered most. We named her Grace, a name that felt fitting after everything we'd been through. Holding her in my arms, I promised that I'd do everything in my power to protect her and Riley, no matter what. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, but as I looked at my little family, I felt hopeful for the first time in a long while. Life isn't perfect, and our story is far from over. But we're here, we're healing, and we're ready to start this new chapter together. And that, more than anything, is what keeps me going.